Coming up in a few weeks. It's That's right.
Friends, we are about to begin. Dr. Huebner is ready to get started, so if we can come forward, please. I'd like to welcome our friends who are joining us online. Welcome to Grace St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm Ollie Rencher, a member of the clergy team, and so glad to gather today with Dr. Tim Huebner, who will speak about faithfully teaching American history in the 21st century. Dr. Huebner has been several times to Grace St. Luke's. He was just reminding us that this is his fourth time to be with us, and every time that he comes, he invites us and engages us in several important ways, so we welcome him. I've had the privilege of knowing Tim for many years now, and it's always nice to see him in this space. He's a very active member of Calvary Church, but he's on loan to us today. So let us give thanks, and I'll invite us to begin our time in prayer. The Lord be with you. Also with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks and praise for the gift of this new day, this opportunity to gather for learning and growth and spiritual formation. Thank you for the ministry of Dr. Tim Huebner and all others who are guests that come and share with us in this parish. Be with us in this time of engagement, and may we leave with more information to inform our lives. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. Welcome, Dr. Tim Huebner.
I think I've just turned on the microphone. All right, great. Well, thank you, Ollie, and thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I have been here several times before, and as I just keep saying to Ollie, if you want to keep having me back, I'm always happy to come. So thank you for the invitation. And I just wanted to say at the outset, I am going to be talking about the teaching of history as an academic subject, but I really don't want this to be kind of just an academic talk. I don't want this just to be like, another interesting thing. I really want it to happen on the level of formation so that we're really able to take some lessons from what we're going to talk about in these two sessions. So I will be with you also next week, and I hope that this opportunity serves us well as we can have a chance to talk with each other about what it means to study the history of our country, how we teach it, and how we sort of talk about it as people of faith. All right? So, you've probably noticed that history and the teaching of history has been in the headlines lately. In fact, if you looked at the New York Times today, there's a big piece by Henry Louis Gates, there's another piece by Charles Blow. Folks are continuing to write about a whole range of subjects having to do with how we teach the history of the United States. So some of these phrases, some of these headlines, some of these buzzwords ought to be out there. You've probably heard of something called critical race theory, or CRT. You may have heard of the 1619 Project, which was published a few years ago at the 400th anniversary of the first African who came to North America in 1619. You've probably heard a little bit about the controversy in Florida having to do with Governor Ron DeSantis and the recent passage of the so-called Stop Woke Act. So there's been a lot of controversy, a lot in the headlines lately about our history, how we should understand it, how we should frame it, how we should teach it, and the sort of lessons that we should take from it. And so what I want us to try to do here today, especially, and next week will be a little bit different, but today I want us to think about how we got here. How we got here. How we got to this moment. How we got here in this moment in the year 2023 where talking about the teaching of history is so important and occupies such an important sort of space in our public discourse. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of historical interpretation. All right, so this is going to be the history of history. Okay, something that those of us who are in the field call historiography. All right, so if we are going to understand why we're talking about the teaching of history in this way, first we have to go back and we have to look at the historians. Okay, because we can't have any textbooks with any content in them unless there are historians who do the actual research first, which ends up over time in those textbooks. All right? So we're going to start with the historians, with the academics, okay, with the folks who have PhDs who study history for a living, people like me. All right? And we're going to look at what they were doing decades ago, okay, because that helps us to figure out why we are where we are right now, okay? So, once again, this is an exercise in the history of historical interpretation, historiography. Back in the post-World War II years, the moment right after the end of World War II, into the 1950s, the time of the Cold War, even into the early 1960s, there was a dominant way of thinking about the history of the United States, especially if you went into graduate school and you were studying American history. It would have been presented from the perspective of there being a national consensus. And so the scholars who were writing at this time were writing a very unifying narrative of the history of the United States. It was a sort of narrative that emphasized high politics and ideas. So the idea was that history was really the history of politics and presidents and the passage of laws and the Supreme Court and all of those things that happen at that national high level when it comes to policy and politics and ideas. And the idea was then that all of those who were writing at this time really believed and argued in their sort of research, in their work, that America was unique in the world. Understand, this is the moment at the end of the Second World War. It's the advent of the Cold War. So the United States is at odds with the Soviet Union and is trying to distinguish itself from this other great superpower. And it's sort of, as it's writing its own history, it's trying to figure out how and why America is the way it is and why it's so unique. And so it's this very unifying national narrative focusing on politics and American democratic institutions. If there's any book that sort of symbolizes this way of thinking about and writing about history at the time. It was Daniel Boorstin's The Genius of American Politics. Basically, I mean, you can see from the title of that book that the argument of that book is that America isn't just different, it's exceptional, it's superior. And it's an emphasis then on democratic institutions. That's what made America great or successful or superior, was this emphasis on its institutions. So we can see from that book title that, I mean, there's this national narrative of unity, which is the dominant way of thinking about and writing about the history of the United States. So understand what I'm saying. I'm saying that current events in the 40s, 50s, and 60s shape how scholars are writing about history, okay? And that's always true, okay? Each generation, as they say, writes its own history. And that's true back in the 1950s. So this is this very unifying narrative. It's this whole idea that's, that there's such a thing as a consensus history of the United States. Well, as you might imagine, current events in the 50s and the 60s start to alter this understanding of American history. So with the advent of a sort of movement for civil rights, with all of those struggles for social justice in the 1960s, what happens is that there's a revolution in how we wrote the history of the United States. And it's called the Social History Revolution. So we move away from a consensus that focused on politics and institutions and ideas to this new understanding of history. And so this really starts to become important, especially in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And just to give you some framework, I started my undergraduate study of history in 1984 at the University of Miami. So when I started studying history, social history is all the rage, right? So it's this whole notion of actually not studying elites and politics and ideas and institutions and precedents and laws. It's actually, let's study non-elites. Let's study history not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Let's study the history of those whose voices had never been heard, the poor and the marginalized, those who had been held in slavery, or women, or ethnic minorities. And all of these new histories start to be written in the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, just to give you some insight in how historians do their work, it's much easier to write the history of politics and ideas and elites because we have a lot more sources, and many of those sources are published, so we can get at those pretty easily. This research is a lot harder. It's painstaking. It takes a lot of time because you have to dig into the archives. You have to look at all sorts of new and different sources that historians had never looked at before. So if you're going to understand the history of slavery, for example, you have to look at whatever slave narratives you can find, and there weren't very many. Or you have to look at sources that had been written by slave owners, but you have to read them from a different perspective. Or you have to look at the census and see who was born when and who died when and who lived where. Or you have to try to piece together whatever fragments of information you can in order to write all of these new histories of these groups whose histories had never been written. They had been left out of that national narrative, right? So this new understanding of history is a lot more localized and specialized. Historians start to think, well, maybe I should spend years in the archives in this one place, digging into every source that I could find, from courthouse records, from old deeds, property records, all sorts of things that will help me to understand how ordinary people lived in that place and that time. So this is a very specialized, very narrow sort of history that starts to break up that national consensus. All of these histories are disparate and different of all these different people who lived in different places in different times. It's much more diverse, but it also leads to this fragmentation of that larger narrative of national unity. All right? So does this make sense? All right. If there's one book that sort of helps us to understand all of this new history, it would be John Blasingame book published in the middle of the 1970s in 1976 called The Slave Community. And Blasingame argued that those held in bondage had their own community and culture separate from the lives and the will of the master. If you set aside all of those who owned slaves, but if you looked at enslaved people themselves and the sources that they produced, which is difficult, so you have to look at folklore and songs and quilts and oral histories and stories that have been passed along and court records and property records and all of that. If you look at all of that, then you can see that there's an actual vibrant culture among those who lived in the slave quarters. Well, that's a very different understanding of history than Daniel Borston's The Genius of American Politics, right? No longer are we looking at high politics and American institutions. Now we're looking at the lives of everyday folk, and not just everyday folk, people who were held in bondage, but who had a sense of dignity and who were able to carve out their own sort of culture, right? Very different way of understanding history. All right, so we can see that the writing of history among those in academia is shifting. And it's shifting based on what's happening in the society at that time, right? All right. Which takes us then into the 1990s, into what I would call the first round of the history wars. And I'd say right now we're in round 2, all right? Maybe round 3, but I'm going to say we're in round 2, all right? And the first round happens in the 1990s. So after all of this work has been written, all these new histories have been written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and that finds its way into textbooks by the 1990s. What happens in the early 1990s is the National Endowment for the Humanities, working with scholars from universities and from educators all over the United States, work on something called the National History Standards. And they're actually issued in 1994. This is when Bill Clinton is president. This leads to a controversy because the former chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, a woman by the name of Lynn Cheney, makes much of what these new national history standards leave out. She argues that basically, in a famous op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in 1994, she argues that basically liberals have hijacked the teaching of American history. And what they're trying to do is to put forth a politically correct version of American history as opposed to a patriotic version, okay? This ought to sound vaguely familiar, all right? So this is round 1 in the 1990s. In 1994, there's big controversy, but the controversy is mostly confined to historians and educators. I mean, she does write an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, so this enters the public debate, but not in the same way that we've seen over the last few years, all right? So this is an important debate, and it basically leads to a whole slew of books. One, this book on the left, History on Trial, Culture Wars and the Teaching of the Past. This is written by some of the scholars, some of the educators who had been at the forefront of actually drafting the national history standards. And what they're doing is they're explaining the whole controversy and they're defending their actions, right? Lynn Cheney starts to publish a series of books for children, especially, that teach American history from a patriotic point of view. That's her way of sort of phrasing it. And so basically, Cheney's whole criticism with these national history standards had been, for example, that that if you looked at all of the national history standards, that they mentioned, for example, Harriet Tubman more than they mentioned George Washington. And so it's always this sort of question of how much emphasis should we put on this or that topic? That's what they're arguing. And by emphasizing slavery or spending more time talking about Harriet Tubman, she's arguing that what's happened is that the national history standards is a politicized or sort of liberal version of American history. So this is this first round in the history wars in the 1990s, all right? Now, let's fast forward many years, about 15 to 20 years almost, and we're going to talk about another flashpoint in how we understand the history of the United States. But especially this next controversy has to do with how we understand the history of the American South, and especially the Confederacy. And I would argue that this whole moment over how we understand the history of the American South and the Confederacy starts especially with the murder of those African Americans who were in Charleston having a Bible study, and suddenly their Bible study is interrupted by this young man, Dylan Roof, who in several images and social media postings had images of himself with Confederate flags, such as this one. He walks into the Bible study and he murders 9 people at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. This is a horrific and a painful episode, a national tragedy. And at that moment, with Barack Obama as president, and of course you may recall President Obama goes to Charleston, sings Amazing Grace. It's this important moment as our country is now starting to deal with this racial history, and especially with Confederate symbols. And that whole conversation is going to continue in the next few years, especially with the election of Donald Trump, who I would argue, and many would argue, I think, is elected in reaction to the first black president of the United States. So Trump is elected in 2016. And in 2017, as some of the monuments and flags have started to come down after this 2015 massacre, in the news, if you're watching lately, of course, Nikki Haley was the governor of South Carolina at the time of this massacre. She takes a strong stance against the Confederate flag and says it needs to come down on the State House grounds. So she takes that step. Others take it in New Orleans and in Memphis. You may recall in Memphis in December of 2017, the Forest Monument comes down. I worked with a small group of students from Rhodes College in the fall of 2017 and the spring of 2018 to put up a new historical marker at the site where Nathan Bedford Forrest operated a slave market in the 1850s. So all that is happening in this short time period from 2015 to 2018. Most important of all of this is probably when Donald Trump is president in 2017, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, right? And that had to do with, once again, a flashpoint over a statue of Robert E. Lee. Like, should this statue come down? Especially Richmond and Charlottesville, if you think about their histories, very much tied to the Confederacy. And so it's in that moment in 2017, as there are marchers at the Monument for Lee in Charlottesville that the United States especially starts to become polarized over this issue of Confederate monuments. And it's not just those monuments. It's all of this history. It's this lost cause version of the Civil War, right? That phrase, lost cause, is important on this slide, understanding that starting about 30 years after the American Civil War, at the end of the 19th century, all of these monuments are put up in the 1890s and early 1900s as a way to memorialize and to venerate the cause of the Confederacy. And so what's happening about 100 years later now is that Americans are having a sort of reckoning with the history of the Civil War and the Confederacy, and it's very closely tied to race, right? It is extremely tied to race and to racism and to slavery and to Jim Crow segregation, all of these issues. But it's starting especially in 2015 with the murders in Charleston. That's when this whole reckoning really begins over symbols of the Confederacy. And then, all of a sudden, in 2020, we have the murder of George Floyd. Tragic killing of a man at the hands of police. Video in such a way that people can see it instantly all over the world. And a witness who's a bystander captures this video on her cell phone and shares it with everyone. And this then, of course, causes a much bigger debate over policing and criminal justice, prisons, no-knock warrants, and systemic racism, and all of those things that we've been talking about in this country ever since. So I want you to think about what has happened. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to draw a connection, okay, between that first round of the history wars in the 1990s, politically correct history versus patriotic history. We add on to that this whole debate over the lost cause and Confederate monuments, which brings race into the issue. And then, with the death of George Floyd, race is now at the center of this whole debate, not only about the teaching of the Confederacy and of flags and monuments and symbols, but now this whole issue of how we teach the history of the United States. All right? I'm arguing that all these things are sort of connected to each other if you look at this whole evolution of how we've been talking about the history of the United States. And what's happened recently, especially, is this whole debate, if you can boil it down to a question or a few questions, you would probably boil it down to something that looked or sounded like this. Is racism endemic to the U.S.? Is it historical, deeply rooted, institutional, systemic, structural, so deeply rooted that it's endemic? It's a part of the American story so much so that you can't extract it. Is it endemic to the history of the United States? And if so, what does that mean, especially for the teaching of American history? How should we teach the history of the United States if racism and white supremacy are endemic to the history of the United States? All right? So this is what our country has been grappling with for the last several years, right? Now, we add on to that what I mentioned earlier, the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project is making the argument that, yes, racism is endemic to the United States and has been from the very beginning when the first African was brought to these shores in 1619. And if you look at this book, and it's not just a book, it starts as a magazine article in the New York Times, it turns into a book, a podcast, children's book. Like, this has taken on a life of its own. It has been revised, updated, republished. So this is 4 years ago, right? 1619. 4 years ago, 2019, the 400th anniversary of this date. Right? And if we look at the introduction to the very first version of the 1619 project as it was originally published in the New York Times Magazine, the goal of the 1619 project is to reframe American history, making explicit that slavery is the foundation on which this country is built. So pay attention there to that word, reframe, okay? Because understand that when we talk about the study of history, we're always talking about facts, events, and the lives of people who lived prior to ourselves. How we frame those stories, what we emphasize, what we de-emphasize, the stories that we tell, the stories that we leave out. That's the essence of historical interpretation. History is an interpretive enterprise. Don't ever let anyone tell you that there's such a thing as real history, and then there are those who have tried to revise it, or something like there's real history and there's revisionist history. All history is revisionist. All history is interpretive. Every generation, as I showed you earlier, is always rewriting history, always trying to reframe it, okay? So when they use the word reframe, what they're talking about is shifting the emphasis, shifting the starting point, shifting that idea of how we tell this story, okay? Now, as you might imagine, this is a very controversial claim. And it fits with that idea that racism and white supremacy are endemic to the United States. That's basically what you can take away from this introductory point. They're arguing that slavery has always been at the center. Well, since this is all tied in with politics, okay, because Donald Trump is president in 2019, you remember everything was political, right? It still is. But especially then, everybody was amped up. Everyone, both sides, arguing, watch cable TV from 2016 to 2020. Can't get away from it, right? So when this is published, when this is issued, it leads to, as you might expect, a counter-argument, a new version, which is really the old version, and that is the 1776 report. So you want to see the parallelism, right? 1619 project, 1776 report. I mean, and if you just look at them, I mean, they look kind of similar. I can't figure out the forward from the backward. Sorry. All right. Yeah. Anyway, so you see how they're similar looking, right? So this is issued in the waning days of the Trump presidency. This is issued in December or January as Trump is actually leaving office. So January of 2021. And this 1776 report basically offers a counter-argument to the 1619 project. A different emphasis. A rediscovery of our shared identity rooted in our founding principles is the path to a renewed American unity and a confident American future. That's from the introduction of the 1776 report. A rediscovery. And they're right about that in the sense that much of what they're talking about is going back to the consensus history of the 1950s that we started with today. It's a sort of they're trying to return back to an older version of the past to a story that we told ourselves about ourselves in the 1950s. That's part of what they're saying. But also, they're emphasizing our shared identity, right? Rooted in founding principles. So ideas, politics, those things will be at the center of this narrative. Okay? And so the folks who write this will present this once again in the same way that Lynn Cheney is making the argument in the 1990s. They will argue that this is a patriotic history and one that emphasizes national unity. Right? So you can see what's happening now. What's happened is that the whole debate then has shifted from scholars who were writing the 1619 report to politicians and public office holders who are now issuing this document in early 2021. So you can see how this has turned into a very public political debate. And you can see also how the ground has shifted so that it's largely a debate over race and racism. Because what happens next, as you may know, is in 2021, we start to see laws such as the Tennessee law, the Tennessee Prohibited Concepts Law of 2021. So I would argue that these laws in Tennessee and Florida and other states are a sort of response to the national racial reckoning that is paired with 1619 in order to say that racism is endemic. Now this is the counter-argument to racism being endemic. Certain concepts, according to this Tennessee statute, are not allowed to be taught in schools. An individual, by virtue of the individual's race or sex, is inherently privileged, racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or subconsciously. An individual, by virtue of the individual's race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. An individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or another form of psychological distress caused solely by one's race or sex. This state or the United States is fundamentally or irredeemably racist or sexist. These are all prohibited concepts. And so again, the state of Tennessee in 2021, this is very recent, this is just in the last few years, is offering its own response to the 1619 Project and this idea that systematic racism or institutional racism or structural racism ought to be the basis for how we understand the history of the United States. They're arguing in opposition to that, and all of these other things flow out of this fourth principle here. And it is, we do not want to teach our children that their country is irredeemably or fundamentally racist. Therefore, we don't want them to feel guilty about what their ancestors might have done to black people in the United States. All of these concepts are now prohibited in the teaching of history. But I want you to understand where this comes from, what this whole moment is, and I hope that what I've been trying to do here is to sort of show you where we are and where all this comes from, right? Okay, and that takes us then to Florida. Florida has especially been in the news, although, you know, Tennessee or other states are also doing this, but Florida has been especially in the news because the governor of Florida is a national political figure, and there's been a lot of talk that he's going to run for president. So therefore, there's just been a lot of media camped out in Florida covering his every move, and what's happened is he's made a lot of news lately, and I think if you're running for president or you want to run for president, then you want to make a lot of news. You want to make a big splash, right? And so what's happened in Florida is actually very similar to what had already happened in the state of Tennessee. The so-called Stop Woke Act takes these same prohibited concepts says you can't teach those concepts in Florida either. It adds to that language basically the idea that by teaching the history of white supremacy, that basically what you're doing is you're indoctrinating students or trying to persuade them of a certain sort of political view. And then finally, most recently, you probably know that the governor was not willing to accept the AP course in African American Studies that had been established by the College Board. So there's been a lot of talk about this, especially in Florida. So what I want to do with the few minutes that I have left is I want us to think about what does all of this mean, and then I want to offer you just a short preview for what we're going to do next week. Okay. First, history, as I said, is an interpretive enterprise. It's always subject to debate. It's always affected by the forces and the tensions in our own time. So what's happening in our own day affects how we write the history of our country. We saw that in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and we're seeing it again now. So in that sense, what we've been through, it shouldn't be surprising that we're having a big debate about the teaching of history. Especially because, second, we live in a very polarized time, as all of us know, and we should expect that that polarization is going to manifest itself in divisions over the teaching of history. And especially the public debate over race and racism has taken center stage. And I do want to emphasize at this point, okay, because in the first round of the history wars in the 1990s, that was not a debate about race. It was really it was much more of a debate about this notion at the time of political correctness, kind of liberals ascending to positions of power in academia and having the power to write the history of the country. That debate was not happening at the same public level that we've experienced in the last few years. It was largely not over race in the same way that what we've been dealing with over the last several years is. So next time, as we think about all of this, I want to offer you sort of a preview of this, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions. I know you have thoughts or things you want to say. I've just tried to give you an overview of how we got here today. I haven't really given you any solutions or any answers yet. Okay, but that's going to be next week, all right? So next week, I want us to think about how should we as Americans and as people of faith approach all of this, okay? And two things, and it's actually more the second than the first. First, I'm going to start from the perspective of that we should probably teach a history that is true to our motto, a pluribus unum, from the many one. I want to talk about what all that means, what I think it means next week. But more important than that, as a person of faith, and this is where we get to the formation level, okay, this is where I want us to talk about what it means to know and to understand and teach this history and to study it from the perspective of a person of faith. More importantly, I think that we need to be informed by three principles, three virtues. Honesty. Honesty means what, or it ought to be, what historians have always done. Of course, we know that they haven't always been honest because you have to make choices, and the choices that we make about which stories to tell and which sources to leave in, which ones to leave out, as we've seen, that's always been a part of what happens in the study of history. But honesty means If something is in the primary sources, if we know that it's true, we have a duty to tell it. If we know that millions of people were held in bondage, if we know that thousands were lynched, if we know the horrors of Jim Crow segregation, we need to be honest about that. We need to talk about all of it. So honesty is one thing I'm going to talk about next week. Second, humility. Now this one's hard, okay? Because sometimes when we're honest, we allow that to kind of turn into not just a sort of moralistic perspective, but a self-righteous perspective. So not just honesty, but also humility. And I'm going to pair those things together next week and really try to dig into that, okay? Because there's a real danger that we end up being self-righteous about things, and I don't think we want to do that. Right? So I'm going to try to think about ways that we can avoid that next week. So, humility in terms of how we read about our ancestors, how we judge them, if we judge them, should we judge them, all of that. And finally, hope. That might not be one that you expect, I don't know. But I think it's pretty important. I think St. Paul thought it was pretty important. Faith, hope, love, right? So hope, I think it's pretty important. Of those three, it's probably the one we talk about the least, right? But I'm going to talk a little bit about hope as well, and what it has to do with our study of history. So that's all a preview for next week. So I hope that what I've done here today is to explain a little bit about how we got here, what the whole debate is, and then next week I'm going to try to help us find a way through it. All right, if that makes sense. Okay, and I'm happy with whatever time we have left to entertain any questions, thoughts, or comments.
I was surprised you didn't mention Howard Zinn.
So, could just as easily have mentioned specific historians. There are a lot of historians to mention. Howard Zinn, some of you may know, for many years, Howard Zinn wrote many years ago a book called The People's History of the United States, which writes a counter history to the consensus history that I started with. Zinn is always trying to challenge authority, always trying to speak truth to power, always looking for the ulterior motives, always thinking about the role of capitalism and self-interest in institutions, and always sort of seeing institutions and policies as almost sort of a cover for really what's going on underneath, right? Zinn writes from a very interesting perspective, and it helps to make the larger point that there are a lot of ways to tell the story, the history of the United States. We've talked about several of them. Zinn definitely falls into that social history category, trying to counterbalance that dominant 1950s narrative of consensus. But yeah, very interesting observation. Certainly a significant figure in all of this.
Can you explain the textbooks that are in the high schools today? I mean, where they are on the spectrum, and who chooses the textbooks?
Yeah, I am going to defer that to those in the room who know more about that. I know Mr. Larch is here. He probably has some thoughts about that. Maybe you don't. I mean, so my understanding is that each state has its own standards for the teaching of history. So, for example, if you look at the standards for teaching American history in the state of California versus the state of Texas, there's a different emphasis, all right? So there are many things that they will have in common, but they emphasize different things. So, for example, if you're looking at the textbooks in California, and they're writing about nativism, and they're writing about the history of immigration, there's a very intentional emphasis on writing about that from the perspective of those who have been immigrants. The Texas textbook in their standards adds to that perspective the point of view of a border patrol, all right? So, I mean, there are different voices, different things that they're trying to emphasize. Every state, as I understand it, has its own standards and has the ability to choose its own textbooks. Now, big states like California and Texas occupy a big share of the market. So there is a capitalist element of this too, because there are publishers that publish all these books. They have to be responsive to those big states where there are a lot of students who are going to, have to read those books. So that is kind of another element of it. Finally, especially recently, there's been a lot of controversy, not at the state level, but at the local school board level. We saw this especially when Glenn Youngkin was elected governor of Virginia in 2021. Big controversies over the so-called teaching of critical race theory in Virginia at that moment, and all of those battles were happening at the local school board level. There were people showing up at school board meetings who were upset that they had heard that their students were being taught critical race theory, and so a lot of that political mobilization led to Youngkin being able to be voted in as the governor of the state. So it's always a sort of dialogue when it comes to what's happening at the state level, also the local school board level, but also thinking about the business of publishing textbooks, which is also part of the picture. I don't know whether you wanted to add anything to that, or anyone else who knows specifically.
The only thing I'd say that's interesting to me is one of the, because obviously I teach at an independent school, so we're not, we just sort of get to pick whatever we want. And I teach an AP class, so we use a college book. But what's fascinating, and I thought about when you were talking earlier about the way the narrative has shifted from the 50s. This isn't a book I use, but a lot of my colleagues use the Brinkley textbook on American history, which is a standard sort of college textbook.
Right.
Starts out in the 1940s is a T. Harry Williams textbook, and then as he dies, people's names come on and come on. If you look at the book, even the 2023 edition, 2022, whatever, versus the 1945 edition, a lot of the words is the same. What's changed is stuff gets added, over the years, some stuff gets added in, some stuff gets taken out. But it's almost kind of like when you look at the King James Bible versus the Bishop's Bible, it's like this, 70, 80, 90% is the same over 8 decades. And you're just, as we have a social history revolution, we're going to add this section in, and we're going to add that section in. But it's remarkable how much of that book today is 80 years old. It just
very interesting.
Thank you for being here and sharing this with us this morning. My question is, as a student in history, and you had mentioned earlier that sort of round one of the wars, there were fewer sources. It strikes me that now we're bombarded with sources, and how do you, what is your process for identifying what's a legit interpretive source for history, or that's not just noise and chatbotness kind of thing?
It's always a great question about sources. So the farther back you go in the study of history, the fewer sources you have. The closer you get to the present, the more sources you have. So in a sense, it's much harder to write the history of the 17th and 18th century than it is the 21st century, right? When you're looking at sources, and especially if you're dealing with recent history where you have huge numbers of sources, this whole problem of making those choices, okay, because it's impossible to include every source. Right? There's no such thing as a total history. It's not as if you could write sort of complete history of the United States. Like, there is no such thing, because there are so many sources you would need to rely on. It would take, it's not even possible, right? And which was part of the reason why some of those scholars in the 1970s and the 1960s saw a virtue in digging in one place. So theoretically, you could go camp out in some small town somewhere and live there for 20 years and go through everything in that courthouse basement and everything that has ever been written that had to do with that local place. And I mean, you could write a pretty good comprehensive history of it. But if you're talking about trying to write the history of America, like, that's so broad. I mean, you're talking about 300 million people now, but even you're talking about so many people who've had so many different experiences over time. There's no way to capture all of those stories. So you always have to make choices about which sources you will read and which ones you will elevate and which ones you won't read or which ones you will keep out. That's why the whole enterprise is always interpretive, and some would say always political, right? I mean, there will always be some choices that you will have to make when you're looking at sources. But to sort of go back to your question one last time, as I'm thinking about a course on, say, the 19th century United States, which is in itself a big topic, so 1800 to 1900, you've got 14 weeks, you're going to cover all of it. What do you pick? Like, if this is the only shot that you have with these students, like, this is the only history class they're ever going to have, let's say. They're not history majors. Let's say they're going to major in neuroscience. So you've got them for one semester, and you've got 14 weeks. You want to try to teach them 19th century American history. I'm going to try to pick a wide variety of types of sources that give a lot of different perspectives. And I'm going to try to pick topics that I think are important for understanding, especially what comes after the 19th century. So I'm going to be biased toward, I don't think we can understand race relations in the 20th and the 21st century unless we understand Reconstruction after the Civil War. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the Reconstruction period than some other folks. And I'm going to have them read sources from the perspective of African Americans and from, white Southern politicians who are trying to keep African Americans from having rights after the Civil War, but also from the perspective of the radicals who are trying to give folks new rights. And so I'm going to actually try to tell that story with as many sources as I can that are in dialogue with each other. But, I mean, there's no sort of perfect way to do this other than to try to give, I think, a wide variety of sources. I don't know whether that helps to answer your question, if that answers what you're trying to get at. Yeah. Okay.
Friends, thank you for gathering today. And again, let us give thanks for Tim Huebner.
Okay, thanks. All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Yes, next week. Oh, good. 28. Long time.
Good, glad you're
Okay,
here.
all right. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Look forward to next week.
Yosemite was also
Right. Initially, children were about